Welcome, Mainan Ellingson, to the Democracy Project. We are very excited to be speaking with you today. And I'd love to start by reading your bio, and then we're going to jump into some questions, questions that I think our teens will find relevant. And we did just, election day was 2 days ago. So I might need to ask you some questions about that election, the midterms that we just had as well. So at the age of 24, Mainan Robinson, a recent widow, was elected to serve as one of the 100 delegates to write a new constitution for Montana. At the time, she was in a political science master's program at the University of Montana, having completed her BA in history and having just passed the eligibility age. What was the eligibility age, Mainan? Was it
24?
Okay, 24. When her professor suggested that she run. 64 candidates filed for Missoula County's 8 seats, which was narrowed to 24 in a primary. In the general election, Mainan obtained the second highest number of votes in an evenly balanced delegation of 4 women, 4 men, 4 Democrats, and 4 Republicans. One of a total of 19 women at the convention, Mainan Robinson was named as one of the 10 most influential delegates. And we're going to dig a lot more into why that was and what Mainan did at the convention. So after the convention, Mainan taught for 1 year at Hellgate High School, and with financial aid and encouragement from fellow Constitutional Convention delegates, she attended the UM Law School and graduated with honors in 1976. After 6 years in the Missoula City Attorney's Office, she joined the Minneapolis law firm of Dorsey and Whitney and practiced municipal bond law for over 30 years. She was elected as a founding member to the American College of Bond Lawyers and received many awards and acknowledgments for her work nationally and particularly in Montana. She was named a Super Lawyer of the West and is credited with innovations in the area of public finance for the state of Montana and its local governments. She has been active in various community boards and organizations, including the United Way, Five Valleys Land Trust, the Missoula Art Museum, the Flagship Program, and most recently, the Missoula Public Library Foundation and its capital campaign for the best new library in the world. The city of Missoula recently proclaimed the week of October 24th as Mainan Ellingson Week in recognition for over 50 years of public service. Mainan loves music, sailing, reading, biking, cooking, art, traveling, and being engaged in the world. She is the proud mother of son Nathan, who lives in the Bay Area with his wife Julie and daughters Scarlett and Romy, and son Mark, who lives in Vermont with his wife Kate and sons Wyndham and Weston. Welcome, Mainan. We are so excited to be talking with you today. So I'm going to start off. I have so many questions for you, but I'm going to start off with just a really open-ended one. What was it like being the youngest delegate and one of the few women, so 19 women out of 100, at the Constitutional Convention in 1972? What was that like?
Well, it certainly was and probably continues to be the most significant event, life-changing event in my life to date. I mean, and it's interesting being 75 now and having something that happened at age 24 be the most important thing that's influenced your life. So I can't underestimate the significance of that to me, both then and throughout the rest of my life. Certainly, being the youngest delegate brought just in and of itself a significant amount of attention to me and to my work, although there were other young delegates as well. There were 6 of us under the age of 30, which was pretty remarkable. And you mentioned that one of a few women, but the truth of the matter is the fact that there were 19 women at the convention was incredibly significant, because prior to that time, there had never been more than 2 women in the state legislature at any given time. And, our state legislature ranged, but generally had 150, somewhere around 150 members. And there'd never been more than 2 women at any given time. So 1972 was a very significant year for me. It's a significant year for Montana in Montana politics. And I think it was really a significant year for women having that amount of accessibility to higher office, and having such a statewide, women having a statewide platform from which to advocate for all kinds of various interests that these 19 women had.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's interesting that you say it wasn't just like one of only 19 women. It was like 19 women was a win. That was a big victory, and was one of the reasons that happened, that when they elected the delegates for the Constitutional Convention, there was a ban on any sitting legislators being part of that delegation.
That was a significant factor, a very significant factor, because obviously they would have, all the legislators who had chosen to run would have been incumbents, had already countywide name recognition, and I think it would have been very hard to unseat those men, and it was primarily men.
Maybe this is a good time to kind of give a little bit of context for why we were rewriting the Constitution in 1972. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what the original Constitution was like and how it came to be rewritten in 1972.
Well, I think that's very important. A couple of things were going on. There was a movement across the United States to look at state constitutions, realizing how much power under the federal constitution is given to states. I mean, basically, under the federal constitution, any power not explicitly granted to the federal government is reserved to the states. So state constitutions were very, very important. The other issue, of course, was that in order to be admitted to the United States of America in the first place, a state had to have a constitution. And so Montana became a territory in 1864, but it wasn't until 1884 that an effort was made for statehood, because by becoming a state, you could exercise power more independently. It was really a vehicle to become a member of the United States of America. That was the foremost goal. And the convention itself was dominated by the mining interest, timber interest, and the mercantile interest. And of course, women did not have the right to vote, and the Constitutional Convention in 1889 explicitly denied women the right to vote. But it was a constitution that really pretty much preserved the interest of the powers that be and wasn't really focused on government. As a matter of fact, I think it's safe to say that the framers of the 1889 Constitution really didn't care whether government functioned well at all, because they didn't really want government interfering in their business. So with that, and with the state constitution that had been amended quite a few times, in a constitution that really did not serve the people well, Montana started in a process in 1968, studying the Constitution. The legislature convened a committee to study the Constitution to recommend whether it should just be amended or whether it should be rewritten by a new Constitutional Convention delegate. A lot of preparatory work was done, and that issue of whether to call a constitutional convention was submitted to the voters in 1969, and the voters overwhelmingly approved a call to a constitutional convention. And again, hats off to the League of Women Voters who worked tirelessly to show the defects and deficiencies in the old Constitution and really educate Montana citizens about the need for a constitutional convention.
Yeah. Well, can you talk to us about some of the provisions that were on the table for being included in the new Constitution? I know you worked really hard on some of those provisions specifically, and that you co-wrote the preamble to the Constitution also. So can you talk to us about the provisions that were that you see as like the most significant that we enjoy now because of that Constitution?
Yes, I mean, there are really quite a few provisions of the Montana Constitution that makes it stand out from other constitutions. First and foremost, I think the most overarching principle about this Constitution is the faith that it showed in the delegates, the faith that the delegates had in the people of Montana. From the very beginning and throughout almost every article, you see how important popular sovereignty is, the right to vote, the right to propose laws by initiative, the right to have referendum on laws that the state legislature passed, the right to initiate amendments to the state constitution. Overall, it's a document that gives power to the people. And I think it's fitting that the preamble, the first words of our Constitution is "We the people of Montana." So I think we the people of Montana gave ourselves power to form the federal government says to form a more perfect union. We gave ourselves the power and ability to form a perfect state government. And it's perfect, I think, in the sense that it took a lot of things from the federal Constitution and our old Constitution, the traditional separation of powers. We tried to strengthen the legislative branch of government because it had been the weakest among the three branches of government. And we did a lot to strengthen it, and including annual sessions, including creating the ability for them to have interim meetings. Under the old Constitution, it said the legislature met every other year for X number of days. And then that was it. There was no authority for interim meetings. And when you're trying to run a state with a budget the size of our budget, the fact that it was 60 days every other year and no ability to have committees in between, the fact that we changed that and made it an ongoing body for the 2 years, notwithstanding the sessions were limited, but the power of the legislature extended for that 2-year period. That made a huge difference in the governance of the state. Equal branches with checks and balances. I think that's been the beauty of our federal system, and I think it's the beauty of this system. And we really wanted an independent judiciary, a strong legislature, and a strong government. Kind of aside from the structural part of government, which, other than the real enhancement of the legislature, I think the things that we did that were pretty remarkable are the strongest declaration of rights or Bill of Rights in any state constitution. And it covers the gamut in terms of the right to a clean and healthful environment, which at the time only one other state had anything similar to that. We have an explicit constitutional right of privacy, which, as we are learning now, plays out even more significantly in terms of what has happened with the courts, saying the Supreme Court of the United States saying there is not necessarily a federal right of privacy, or if there is a federal right of privacy, it does not extend to a woman's right to choose. So that explicit right of privacy is something that separates our state constitution from a lot of other state constitutions. Other things that we did, and I think this might be kind of relevant to our young students who are participating in the Democracy Project, is it declared that 18-year-olds were citizens and had full rights for all purposes. Now, that later came to be amended as a result of the federal government holding back money if a state allowed 18-year-olds to drink. So that was a big dichotomy. But there's also a recognition of the rights of minors under the age of 18 who also have constitutional rights unless protections serve them. So, for example, their names can be withheld in proceedings that are in the newspaper because that's considered something that enhances their rights. One significant thing that I think is also important to our young participants in our project is the fact that you can run for the legislature at age 18. And since the 1972 Constitution, we've had a 19-year-old be elected to the state legislature. We've had a 20-year-old, we've had 20 and 21-year-old people elected to our state legislature. In our Constitution, we restored the rights of convicted felons once they had served their sentence. Because at that time, if you had a felony on your record, no matter how long you had been out of prison, you were barred from voting. You were barred from ever holding any public office, whether it was county commissioner or any office, legislator. So in 1972, we said no. All rights should be restored once you have paid your debt to society. How else can you engage people to become meaningful citizens if you don't even give them the right to vote?
Because we're talking about this right now, I kind of want to bring it into present day and the election that just happened 2 days ago. And I'm curious on your thoughts about what the picture is like today across the United States, the different states, how things are working at the federal level. What are your thoughts about that and people participating? Because one of the core tenets of the Democracy Project is active civic participation.
One of the things that I think the current election situation across the United States shows is the real importance of state constitutions. I think when we talk about election laws, election laws have generally been something that states were granted. The federal Constitution initially really makes almost no reference to elections. And so that was something that was reserved to the states. So some states had laws that 20, you had to be 20, 21, some states 18, and they allowed states to have different residency requirements. You have to be a resident for so long. And as you see now, both in Montana and elsewhere, different requirements, like, well, you have to have a picture ID, you have to have certain kinds of information, whether or not you can have mail-in ballots, whether or not there can be drop-offs at polling places, whether or not people can collect ballots and drop them off. That has been a matter of state law. And we're seeing, I think, all over the country, efforts to make voting more difficult. And I think it's so misguided because I think people are making, one, I think it's wrong to ever make it harder to vote unless the whole goal is to make sure that the elections are valid and fair and not susceptible to fraud. I mean, we just had a lawsuit in Montana where a former legislator who was a county election administrator testified under oath that the Republican Party in Montana favored not allowing students to use their student ID to vote as a way of identification, because they testified on record that they thought students voted Democratic more than they voted Republican. So it wasn't about, I mean, ostensibly, they're arguing, well, it's to prevent election fraud, but their own testimony indicates that really it's to preserve what they think is their majority. The overturning of the Roe versus Wade case, in the Dobbs case, where the decisions with respect to choice or abortion is going to now be decided on a state by state basis. What comes into play and what was really probably beyond the scope of this, but of what we want to talk about, but this whole interplay of how far can states go in exercising their 10th Amendment rights before they interfere with a fundamental right guaranteed under the federal Constitution. So here I think is a good example. So we know that states are able to regulate marriage. They can determine the age at what people can get married with or without parental consent, the kinds of health and safety tests they have, where you get a license, the fact that you have to get a license. But we also know now, at least based on a US Supreme Court case, that a state can't prohibit interracial marriage. States had prohibited interracial marriage, but there's at some point where the state's rights conflict with a provision of the federal Constitution, and in that case, it's the 14th Amendment, the equal provision, equal treatment of citizens, that those state laws ran afoul of. It's just such a fascinating thing, being a lawyer and just kind of watching over this last 50 years, this power going back and forth between the states and the federal government, and the role of the US Constitution in that.
Well, I think what's fascinating about everything you're saying is I'm just hearing so many different ideas for projects for the Democracy Project, so many different issues, and you're illuminating this power structure for us that maybe it's bringing it into the personal realm and sort of lighting up how what goes on in the legislature, both the federal and the state, really impacts us as individuals. And that's what we're looking for in the Democracy Project, is for our teens to feel what they are energized to work on, and then to impact that through direct action.
Well, and one thing that I think is so helpful for our participants to know, that in spite of the overarching power of the federal government, about 95% of the laws and the rules and the regulations that we all live under are by a byproduct of state legislation and local legislation. And I think it's really important for young people not to overlook the power of local government. But we created a situation where local governments could enact their own home rule charters and legislate in ways that were not denied by the state. Unfortunately, I would say in the last 8 years, we've seen an effort by the state legislature to take away some of the autonomy and power and authority that had been exercised and granted to local governments. I mean, a really good example came about during the COVID era, where the state legislature passed legislation that took away the power of local county health boards to make determinations about masking, about vaccinations, and so on. Well, so now we have with the legislature kind of the problem we saw in 1972, that you've got, at least in that respect, one rule that fits a county of 120,000. The same rule applies for a county of 6,000, when we know that the needs of those counties are so different. I mean, the government that's closest to the people is the city and the county. They meet all the time. The legislature now meets only every other year. So that it's an important issue, and one I think that is ripe for some activity.
I think that fits really nicely with the Democracy Project, because we have 14 sites around the state, and every kind of local government is represented. So from big cities like Missoula and Billings, to unincorporated communities, to tribal communities, to extremely rural communities like Circle, Montana.
Yes.
So we are really excited to see how the teens learn about the government where they are, their local government, because in Montana, we have so many different kinds of local government. So I want to ask my last question, which is just, I guess it'll be 2 questions wrapped up in one. One sort of like just speaking directly to the teens as you just were, what's your call to action for the teens? What do you want to say directly to folks who are ages 13 to 19 in this moment?
The first thing I really believe, and I will unequivocally say that my success at the Constitutional Convention, getting elected in the first place, and then being nominated or designated as one of the most influential delegates, is knowledge. Knowledge is something that can't be taken away from you. And I believe when I ran, again, up against 64 people most all of whom, pillars of our community, a lot of careers represented, years of experience. But I really studied. I really knew what needed to be in a constitution. I just cannot underestimate or won't the value of studying, learning, building for yourself a base of knowledge that can never be taken away from you. And that ultimately you will be able to use that knowledge either for your own good or for the good of the community. And having knowledge just opens up so many doors. I mean, not just power, if you want to exercise power. And I look at power as like being able to do good, be able to get in a position to do good. But that knowledge also enables you to get scholarships to further your education. It's just critical, I think, to being a good citizen is being educated and having knowledge.
Great. Well, I guess we will close it out there. And Maydan, we are so excited to, after we watch the video, compile some more questions, follow-up questions for you, because even though you and I have spoken for almost an hour, there is so much we didn't get to cover. Thank you so much for your time and your generosity and everything you've done for the state of Montana, and for speaking directly to us in the Democracy Project.
Thank you, Jenny. My pleasure.